Okay, we're continuing in our study of the life of Christ and the period following the resurrection. And we're reading out of a harmony of the Gospels so that we get all of the four Gospels integrated into one continuous account. And we're beginning now. We had just talked last time when Jesus appeared to 7 disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he had reinstated Peter to the apostleship because Peter had denied Christ 3 times, and so Jesus is now restoring him to that, to his apostleship, and also recommissioning him. And he had also revealed to Peter that he would live several more years, at least 30 more years approximately, and then he would be put to death by crucifixion as a martyr for Christ. And it told Peter to follow him. So right after this, we'll begin reading to the paragraph. It says, "But Peter turned around and saw following them the disciple whom Jesus loved, who also at the supper had leaned against his breast and said, 'Lord, who is he that betrays you?' At seeing him, Peter said to Jesus, 'But what of this man, Lord?' Jesus said to him, 'If I desire that he remain until I come, what is it to you? Follow me.' Therefore the saying spread abroad among the brethren that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not tell him that he would not die, but said, 'If I desire that he remain till I come, what is it to you?' He is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." Okay, now Peter and John were very close. They were good friends. They had been partners in business, in the fishing business, before Jesus called them to be disciples. And so Peter was curious about what would be in store for John, because Jesus had just told Peter that he would eventually die as a martyr for Christ by crucifixion. And Peter had said before that he'd be willing to die for Christ, and so this was a great honor for Peter to know that he would be dying for Christ. And so he sees John following, and he asks the Lord, "What about him?" Now, Jesus' answer to Peter was really not as harsh as it may seem from the translation into English. It's translated, says Jesus had said, "What is that to you?" Now, this could be said in a really harsh way, but it's not really that harsh of an answer. What Jesus is saying to Peter is that God has his own plans for John, which he just doesn't choose to reveal at this time. I believe John was the only disciple who was not martyred, but I'm not sure about that. There may have been others, but John lived for a long time. He lived into the 90s, about 95 AD, so that would have made him about 95 years old, because he was about the same age as Jesus was. Actually, all the disciples were about the same age. So what Jesus is saying to Peter is that Peter needs to concentrate on his own life and focus on following Jesus, and that what God has for John is not going to be revealed. So Jesus doesn't answer his question, but he answers it. He responds with a conditional statement. It begins with if. If I desire that he remain till I come, what is it to you? So this got distorted, and the Christians thought that Jesus was implying that John would not die before Jesus returned. But that is not what Jesus had said. And so the Apostle John, when he's writing this gospel, he makes that clear that Jesus did not say that John would live until Jesus returned, but had said if, as a conditional statement, if it is his will that he remains. But he is not saying or guaranteeing that will be true. And so we know now, of course, that it's been close to 2,000 years now since the Apostle John died, and Jesus has not come. Now, there's a lot of critics who say that the Gospel of John was not written by the Apostle John, but it was written several hundred years later. And this is one of the evidences that John was the one who actually wrote the Gospel, because if the Gospel had not been written until after John died, then this paragraph would not make any sense. If John was already dead, then this discussion about the saying about him going around that he would live until Jesus died, this whole thing wouldn't make any sense unless the gospel was written before John actually died. And so John would not have even had to make a correction to their misunderstanding, because if John was already dead, then it would have been obvious that Jesus had not said that John was going to live until he came back. So this is one of the strong proofs that John is actually the author of the Gospel of John. You know, there's many critics who like to discredit the Bible and everything, and a lot of them say that the Gospel of John actually wasn't written until about the 3rd century by some unknown person who forged his name to it, and so forth. But anyway, this is one of the strong evidences that John was actually still alive when the gospel was written. Now, also there's another thing about chapter 21 of John, and that is that it seems as though the gospel ends at the end of chapter 20, and then chapter 21 is a separate document which was attached to the gospel and went along with it. And part of that is because there is like a conclusion at the end of chapter 20 where it says that these things are written. Let's see, how does that go again? My mind is just one time. It says, many other things, therefore, Jesus also performed. Now this is chapter 20, verse 31. Many other signs, therefore, Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life through his name. Okay, this sounds like a conclusion. And so, majority of the scholars believe that the Gospel of John actually ends here, and that chapter 21 was another document which just deals with the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John, and that it was written right after he finished the gospel. And so they have always been together. They've never been separate from one another. There's no document or manuscript of the Gospel of John that does not have chapter 21 also attached to it. But anyway, this is just kind of interesting as a sidelight. And then, like chapter 21 begins, after these things, Jesus manifested himself again. That sounds like it's the beginning of something different. And so, if we look at the very last sentence, right after Jesus says, "If I desire that he remain till I come, what is that to you?" Then this next sentence says, "He is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." Who is the we? See, so here we find that some other people are now involved in this document. And what is likely is that we know that John was ministering in the area of Asia Minor, where the 7 churches of the book of Revelation are: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Laodicea, and all those. That the we are the elders in these churches. And so they had requested that John, in addition to his gospel, also write an account of the restoration of Peter and, that's mainly what it is, and his dealings with John there at the end. And so John agrees to do this, and so then the elders of these churches get involved, and they kind of put this sentence in: we know that his testimony is true. And so this also lends credence to the fact that John the Apostle actually wrote this, and that what he wrote was true. But anyway, it's just one of those interesting sidelights that instead of being just one gospel, it's actually 2 documents. The gospel itself ends at the end of chapter 20, and then this last chapter was kind of a separate document that was attached onto the end of the Gospel of John, and it itself has another conclusion. If you look down in verse 25, it says, "There are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books which were written." So this looks like a second conclusion. So we have a conclusion at the end of chapter 20, and another conclusion at the end of chapter 21, which kind of substantiates or kind of supports the idea that these are actually 2 documents which have been put together. Of course, it doesn't take anything away from the gospel, since we know that they were both written by the Apostle John, and so both of them would have been fully inspired. But anyway, this is because the Gospel of John has as its objective to lead people to Christ, and to show that like in chapter 20, verse 31, "But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing might have life through his name." So that was accomplished in chapters 1 through 20. And then chapter 21 has a different objective, and that's to show how Peter was restored to his apostleship and also recommissioned as an apostle. So chapter 21 has a little different objective. Actually, it's quite a different objective than the first 20 chapters. So anyway, this is just an interesting sidelight. Okay, so anyway, the we in this last sentence then is taken by virtually all reputable scholars to be the elders of the churches, the 7 churches, among whom John was ministering, and they had prevailed upon him to write this other account, and they add their own witness to John's testimony. They verify that John is telling the truth, and this is actually John who is writing it. He says, he, that is the one who leaned on Jesus' breast at the supper and asked Jesus who it was that would betray Jesus. Here they said, he is the disciple who testifies these things. And so this is saying that the Apostle John is the one that's actually writing this. So this refutes the claims of the critics who say that this was not written by John in 95 AD, but was written by some unknown impostor 200 or 300 years later. So this verifies that John is the actual writer. Okay, so these things are all points of interest. It's not changing any doctrine or anything like that. It's just adding a little detail to what probably actually happened, and explains the we in here. Okay, and going on then, the next paragraph says, then the 11 disciples proceeded into Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, though some doubted. Okay, remember on the resurrection day when Jesus first encountered some of the women, he told them to go back to the disciples and tell them to go up to Galilee as he had told them, and he would meet them there. Okay, so now this is the fulfillment of that. So it's probably been, this was probably shortly after Jesus had appeared to them by the side of the lake, maybe a few days later. So it's probably been about 3 weeks now since Christ rose from the grave. And as we know, Christ made a number of appearances. He would appear suddenly, and then he would stay and talk and eat with those he appeared to, and then he would vanish. Sometimes the appearance would last only a few minutes, sometimes it would last several hours, and then he would vanish, and we have no written evidence of where he was between his appearances, but the likelihood is that he was in heaven with the Father in between, but we can only, it's only kind of speculation. The other alternative would be he was somewhere on earth, but we have absolutely no written evidence of where he was. So probably, like he said to Mary Magdalene when she first saw him, and she was holding on to him and it seemed like he wouldn't let him go, and Jesus said, don't cling to me because I have not yet ascended to my Father. And so this is about the only hint we have that she couldn't hold on to him permanently, because he had to go to the Father, and he went and returned, made his appearances, and then went back, and then returned again and made some other appearances. But that's probably the most likely scenario, but we have no way of knowing for sure where he was between his appearances. But anyway, when he would appear, it would be a sudden appearance. And then after he would talk, walk with them and eat and whatever else, then he would suddenly vanish out of their sight. Okay, so now we have this appearance on the mountain in Galilee, and this is the one which Jesus had told them about, told them to go from Jerusalem up to Galilee, and he would meet them there. Then the 11 disciples proceeded into Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, though some doubted. Well, there is also an account in by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 where it says that he was seen by over 500 of the brethren at once. Now, there is no account in the Gospels of Jesus appearing to this 500. And some speculate that maybe this included more than just the 11 disciples. Maybe this included many people who had believed on him, who lived in Galilee, and that they also came to the mountain. And so there was a huge crowd here. Now this mountain is not identified, but we know that Jesus had the Sermon on the Mount in this vicinity. It also is on the mountain that he called his disciples and chose them to be his apostles, the 12, and also it was on a mountain, Mount Hermon, which would be further to the north, which is a very high mountain, 14,000 feet, I believe, where Jesus was transfigured. So we're not told which mountain it was, but anyway, at least the 11 disciples, and either on this occasion or on some other occasion, there were over 500 who were gathered together, and Jesus also appeared to them. That's from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, written by the Apostle Paul. So, if that's the case, that this is the appearance where there was the 500 as well as the 11, they had gathered together to wait for him to appear, and then when he does appear, they see him, and by now his relation to them had kind of progressed. The fact that he had already risen from the dead, he has appeared and disappeared, and with the door shut as he came through the wall, or however, or whether he just appeared there. But anyway, now they were fully convinced of his deity, and so they worshipped him. And it says, though some doubted. Now, whether this was some of the 11 disciples that doubted, or whether if the 500 were there, whether this was some of the 500 who doubted. So there's a difference of opinion as to who these are who doubted. And if they doubted, exactly where was it that they were doubting? Were they doubting that he had risen from the dead? Or when he suddenly appeared, did some of them just doubt that it was actually him? If we take it that they still were doubting that it was him, that he had risen from the dead, then just shows all the more how hard it was for these disciples to get it. But anyway, so he goes on in the next paragraph and says, "Then Jesus came to them and addressed them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and upon earth." Okay, now, before Jesus came into the world, of course, he had all authority in his deity. But then he came into the world and he humbled himself and he limited himself, became a man, and now he has risen from the dead and is about to go back to the Father. And so the emphasis, I think, here is on his humanity, that his humanity now is now being elevated, and Jesus is explaining this to him, that all authority has always been with the deity of Christ, with his divine nature, but now his human nature now is also been endowed with this authority. Now, with all authority in heaven and earth, that means that he's got all authority. He can do anything he wants. This is another way of defining free will. He has absolute freedom to do whatever he wills in heaven and on earth. And of course, since Jesus is holy, we know that he has a holy will, and he will only do those things which are holy. Now, you hear a lot of times people talking about man's free will, the free will of man. Well, that's simply not true. Man does not have a free will, not in the absolute sense. Man has a will, and there is limits on that will. Within certain limits, man is able to make a choice. Like maybe an example would be a fish swimming in the river or something. He might be able to go back and forth from side to side of the river, but he can't get out of the river, or in a lake or something like that. So man does have will and the ability to make choices, but the choices are very limited. And for the most part, for the unsaved, virtually every choice that they make will be against God's will. Like Jesus said, men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil, and they will not come to the light. So anytime we talk about the will of man, of the unsaved, we can be assured, or we can have confidence that man on his own cannot come to God without God drawing him and bringing him to himself. But anyway, Jesus has absolute free will because he has all authority in heaven and on earth. He can do anything he wants in heaven or on earth. But we don't have to worry about him using his authority or abusing his authority, because he is holy, and anything he does will be holy. And so then he gives what is often called the Great Commission, which is the next sentence: "Go therefore and disciple all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always until the consummation, or the end of the age." Now, if the whole 500 were there, then this commission is not just limited to the 11 disciples. This is limited. This goes to all the Christians, because he is talking to everyone who is there, and it applies just as much to us as it applied to the disciples. Now, this is a reverse of the way the Jews normally practiced, because they had the temple in Jerusalem, and if a Gentile wanted to worship God, he had to the Gentile had to come into Jerusalem to the temple, or in later years to the synagogue and so forth. The Jews never went out to try to win the Gentiles and convert them to the worship of God. Jonah would have been an exception. Jonah went to Nineveh and he preached, and the Ninevites repented. But that is a glaring exception to the normal rule. And God spared Nineveh for about 150 years, until Nineveh, the Assyrians, they wound up being even more wicked than when Jonah preached to them. And so the Assyrians were then overthrown by the Babylonians. God brought the Babylonians in and destroyed Nineveh. So anyway, this commission was spoken to the 11 disciples, possibly also to the 500, and their assignment was to go into all the world, to all the nations, and make disciples. Now, the way this usually happens is like we send our missionaries out, and they plant churches. And so then the church is the base of operation, and then from a church in a certain locality, in a town or area or something, then the church then is the base of operations. And when people are saved and want the Lord, then they come in to membership of a local church. So in a sense, we're going out, establishing a church, and then that would be the place for corporate worship, or the